Hello everyone and welcome. We are so glad to have you join us today for our webinar on IT architecture for non-architects. I'm Kathy Basquet and I'm with Max Technical Training. I'll be the moderator today. I want to just give you a 30-second commercial. Today's Lunch and Learn is brought to you by Max Technical Training. For those of you who don't know, we're a premier provider of software and professional skills education for IT and business professionals. We deliver training in all the top technologies and methodologies and have been doing so for over 18 years. Clients prefer Max because our trainers are highly qualified experts in their subject areas, such as the gentleman that you'll be hearing today. Our trainers can help clients solve real problems as part of the typical classroom experience. Instruction with us is not one size fits all. We develop and we deliver modified and customized curriculum to fit client needs. We can deliver training privately on your site, or we can deliver training privately here at our facility. We also provide follow-up mentoring, coaching, and consulting for those clients who need that extra boost to transform their training into action. We're just about ready to start, so I have just a few housekeeping tips. Mike is going to present for about 45 minutes. He is open to taking questions throughout the presentation. Everyone's audio is going to be muted, so just type your questions into the question section on your GoToWebinar doc. If there are some questions that he's not able to get to, he will answer them at the end. If you do have comments or if you have issues that are not question related that you want to share with us, use the chat section. We are recording this webinar, and you will receive a link to the recording as well as the slide deck in an email that will be sent out either today or tomorrow at the latest. And I also want to let you know that a part of that email, we are offering 20% off of our courses that will be presented and promoted later on during this webinar. And so you'll want to follow up on that. That's a timely offer, only good until 5 p.m. on Monday. So now I'm pleased to introduce to you Mike Fulton. Mike is president of CC&C Solutions, America's division. CC&C Solutions is a global enterprise architecture consultancy with close ties to the Open Group and TOGAF, the Open Group's architecture framework. Mike is an experienced consultant with over 8 years of experience in enterprise architecture and 20 years of IT experience. He is TOGAF certified, a cloud certified architect. He's led IT for IT architecture, cloud architecture, IT strategic planning. You can read the rest. It just goes on and on. His experience is broad and it's deep. In fact, if any of you are in San Francisco or heading that way next week, he is going to be speaking at the Open Groups Conference on IT for IT, and later on in this year in London on both TOGAF and IT for IT. So without any more, welcome, Mike. I'm so glad that you're with us today, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Kathy. I appreciate the introduction. So we're going to start out our conversation today really telling a little bit of a story, and excuse me, my throat's got a little bit of a frog in it. Always a great way to start a presentation. So we're going to start a little bit of an enterprise architecture story by first looking at two key elements of any business: strategy and execution. As you know, strategy is the big picture. Strategy is the vision. Strategy is where you're going as an organization. Execution, on the other hand, is the day-to-day. That's how work gets done. It's where the rubber really meets the road. Okay? You can't have a truly successful organization without both. But the difficulty comes in translating our strategies into a plan that we can actually execute. That's where enterprise architecture comes in. Enterprise architecture bridges the gap between strategy and execution. And I apologize, we've got some timing on these slides that's going into effect. So if you bear with me for just a split second, I'm going to shut all that off.
No problem, Mike. That happens sometimes. Mike, while you're doing that, you're at that conference in London. When is that? Because I wasn't able to.
Yeah, the conference I'm going to be doing in London is actually going to be end of April, April 25th through 28th, and that'll be the Open Group Conference in London. I'm actually going to be talking about the topic of IT for IT and how IT for IT works with and supports some of the emerging technologies like social, mobile, and cloud computing, as well as big data and Internet of Things. So if you're not familiar with IT for IT, we're actually going to be doing a webinar on IT for IT here in just a couple of weeks.
February 3rd, I
definitely
think.
would recommend that you come join us for that.
Right, we have one on the 3rd and one on the 4th, so I'm not sure which day. One is value of enterprise architecture and the other is IT for IT. So check that out on our Max website if you're interested. And you ready?
Yep, I am. And again, I apologize for that. So just to recap that first slide very, very quickly, enterprise architecture is how we bridge the gap between strategy and execution. It's creating the executable plan to deliver our strategies, and it's aligning that plan with the organization. Okay. Now, what we do to be able to deliver that plan is we take a look at 4 dimensions of architecture. We call them domains. We'll evaluate the business processes, the data, and the IT assets inside of a company across those 4 domains of business, data, applications, and technology. As we look at those elements of business process data and IT assets, we're going to take a look at how they're used today. We're going to look at how we're going to develop for the future, and we're going to look at how we share those across different parts of the organization for optimal value to the company. Okay, we're waiting on a screen paint here so you guys can stay with me. GoToMeeting seems to be a little slow today. All right, I think you guys are seeing it now. So a metaphor we like to use when we talk about enterprise architecture really is the metaphor of city planning. If you think about enterprise architecture from that perspective, enterprise architecture is really the concept of city planning for IT. We look at the houses in a neighborhood as being applications, and those houses really need to have some similarities. No house is going to be the same, but they need to look and feel similar, so it's easy for neighbors to interact. You need shared infrastructure. A community needs shared infrastructure: sewer, water, pipes. We relate those to the technology infrastructure that you would have in an IT landscape. A community is going to need roads. All right, we relate roads to the business processes of an organization and how you flow the work through an organization over those business processes from application to application. And then we look at, we use either the analogy of a car that travels from place to place, or we also look at the power lines, the energy that flows, as potentially being synonymous with the information that flows throughout an organization. It comes from the power grid and it flows out to all the various houses for different use within each of the different applications. So you can see it's very similar in concept. What that enterprise architecture role is responsible for is taking that step back, just like a city planner does, and making sure that the neighborhood's going to work together, that's going to have everything that it needs. This is a different role, obviously, than the building architect. The building architect is going to be the person that actually designs and manages and helps to build the house, and those are different roles than the city planner roles. And the same is true in the enterprise architecture space, where we've got enterprise architecture roles and what's commonly known as solution architecture roles that are responsible for projects or specific applications. Now, as we again wait for the slide to paint here on the GoToWebinar, we want to think about this from a value perspective. At the end of the day, we're applying enterprise architecture to an enterprise or to a business. And so it's important that we're clear on what the value to that business is, because at the end of the day, we're all about making money. There was a Harvard research study that was done that showed that companies that had a strong foundation in enterprise architecture delivered higher levels of profitability. They were able to get new applications, new products to market faster, and they derive significantly more value from their IT investments, up to 25% lower costs in IT, fewer mission-critical errors, less downtime, and as you can see here, an 80% higher satisfaction rate in the senior management of the organization. So those are some pretty significant numbers, and while this study is a little bit old, it was done in 2006, what I can tell you is that the importance of enterprise architecture in today's world is only increasing. It's getting dramatically more important. So why don't we go ahead and switch over to a quick poll question so we get a little interaction going here. Kathy, you want to pull that poll up?
You betcha. Here we go. So the question for everyone, which of the following is a way that enterprise architecture provides value to the organization? I'd like to see some votes in there. We're going to give it about 30 seconds. Mike, we're starting to see we got 25% of the people have voted.
Very good.
50%, good. Keep it coming, people. You have about 10 seconds, 15 seconds left. 70% have voted. We have some sleepers there. We seem to be sticking at 82%. Let's go, guys. I'll close the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we have an 87% response rate for you here. Let's share the results.
Very good.
Can you see those, Mike?
There they are. Yep. So which of the following is a way that enterprise architecture provides value to the organization? So actually, if you answered B, C, or D, you were correct per the study that we saw on the previous slide. I didn't get any comments on the Q&A. I'm assuming that we actually made a mistake here on the poll question. The poll question was actually supposed to be the negative. We were asking which of these doesn't provide value, because the answers, the ones that do provide value really was B, C, and D. A, knowing the customer better, really was not on the list of that Harvard study that we saw on the previous slide. And in general, knowing the customer better, really, while enterprise architecture could potentially have an impact, it's not as directly related to that. Typically, that's going to be market research and consumer insight that's going to drive understanding and knowing your customer better as an overall corporation. Enterprise architecture can help you know your customer better as an IT organization very well, because it brings you closer to the business, but typically it doesn't have a big role in knowing your enterprise customer better. So thanks for the engagement on that. Hopefully we'll make sure that the next poll, we don't flip the question on that and confuse that, but we'll go on to the next slide. So about enterprise architecture. Enterprise architecture is a 40 years or so. The first framework for enterprise architecture actually got developed back in the late 80s, early 90s, and we're going to take a look at a couple of different frameworks just to give you a sense of what they're. The four big frameworks that talked about are TOGAF, Zachman, FIAF, and DODAF. TOGAF, TOGAF stands for the Open Group Architecture Framework. Zachman and the Zachman Framework is named after the father of enterprise architecture, John Zachman. We'll talk a little bit about him in a minute. TOGAF is the Department of Defense Architecture Framework, and FEAF is the Federal Enterprise Architecture Framework. We will not talk about those in this slide deck because they're more specific to the federal government, and there are several others, but those really have been what the industry has consolidated down onto, those four frameworks, and probably the most popular really are TOGAF and Zachman for corporates rather than government use. There is also an approach that we will talk a little bit about called a hybrid approach, and that's where you bring together pieces from different frameworks in a way that most ideally fits you and your company. That's why you might want to do that as well. So the first thing here is we'll get into a little bit more the first framework on our list, TOGAF. And as I mentioned, TOGAF is the Open Group Architecture Framework. There we go. And when we talk about TOGAF, this is a standard that's managed by the Open Group. They're the same standards body that manages Unix, if you're familiar with that, along with a number of other different standards. IT for IT we mentioned earlier today as well. There have been hundreds of different customer organizations around the world that have contributed to TOGAF over the years. The first version of TOGAF came out in 1993. It used to be based off of what is now known as DODAF, so there was a lot of similarity between the two. But TOGAF has evolved over time, and it now really is an industry-owned framework that's used very broadly across the world. In fact, there are 50,000 TOGAF certified individuals around the world today. And we at CCNC, we do TOGAF training, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We've trained about 10% of the people worldwide that are currently certified in TOGAF. Now, when we talk about TOGAF, the core part of TOGAF, the most recognizable piece of TOGAF, is really what's known as the TOGAF ADM, or the Architecture Development Method. You'll see this picture over on the right when people talk about TOGAF all the time, and it's known as the TOGAF crop circle. TOGAF is really designed to be a framework and a process that can be used over and over again to build out an enterprise architecture, different levels of complexity within an organization. You can use it at different time horizons, different scope, and the process will work the same. That's one of the unique pieces about TOGAF. But there are 6 different components to TOGAF. The ADM is actually just one of them. The next part of the framework that we'll take a look at is the Zachman Framework. And the Zachman Framework really is different. It doesn't provide a process or a method like TOGAF does. It provides an ontology. It provides a structure to collect data about your enterprise. Okay, it's not going to give you the process or the method. It's not going to tell you how to do it. It's going to tell you what to collect. And so that's a key difference between Zachman and TOGAF. In fact, you can actually use the two together very nicely. It becomes a nice approach to use TOGAF and Zachman rather than having to force you to choose one or the other. As I mentioned, John Zachman is the father of enterprise architecture. He created this model back 40 plus years ago, and it was really based off of a model and a way of thinking about architecture, not specifically IT or enterprise architecture. And so he built this out using real-world architecture information and knowledge and then transformed the thinking into what was really necessary to manage our information technology and then eventually our enterprises. And so that's really how that's evolved over time. Now, I mentioned there's a couple of different elements that you can think about here. You can use one of these generic industry frameworks. There's also the ability to use a proprietary framework. Proprietary frameworks might be frameworks that are sold by Gartner or SAP or Microsoft. There's a lot of different companies that sell proprietary enterprise architecture frameworks. Most of the time what we see when that happens, and I apologize, I'm still having some problems with autoplays on these slides, and when I got a build slide like this, it gives me particular problems. But what we see is that most of the time those proprietary frameworks are fairly expensive. Generic frameworks are fairly inexpensive, but they're also generic. They're hard to pick up and use. And then a homegrown framework, you can build a framework yourself for enterprise architecture, but that's going to take quite a bit of time and quite a bit of money as well. And so the ideal state really is to try and get to a place where you take the best of the generic and the homegrown and try and get into what we call a hybrid framework. And that's where you are taking a framework like TOGAF or Zachman and tailoring it for you and your organization so that you get the right balance of cost and benefit for you in the enterprise architecture process. That allows you to minimize your lock-in. It allows you to take advantage of both internal and external resourcing. And it allows you to speed up your time frame. It's critical as you go through that process that you get the right level of executive commitment as well as the right level of enterprise architecture leadership to make that come to life. So let's go ahead and do another poll. Which of the following is not an EA framework? So we got the question phrased correctly this time. We've got TOGAF, DODAF, Zachman, and Fulton.
And everybody's on it. We've got 70% have voted already.
Excellent.
We're going to, maybe we'll hit 100 this time. We have 83, 84% have voted. Keep it open for maybe 10 more seconds. We don't want to take too much time away from the presentation. By the way, while I am on here, remind everyone that if you do have questions for Michael, go ahead and type that into the questions bar, and I can interrupt him, and he'll answer them as he's going. Otherwise, he will answer it at the end. All right, we have 90% voted. I'll close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 90% vote response rate. We'll share that.
Let's see what we got.
Were they right?
All right, we got 2% said TOGAF is not an EA framework. It is. We actually called that one out specifically. 13% said DODAF. 11 said Zachman. We talked about specifically TOGAF and Zachman as being EA frameworks. I also clearly mentioned DODAF, although it wasn't on any of the slides, so I could see why you might have missed that one. Fulton, that is actually my last name, if you didn't pick up on that, and I have not created an enterprise framework that people are using for enterprise architecture. So
not yet.
That is the correct answer. Not yet. Maybe someday, although I doubt it. The stuff that's out there is plenty good enough for people to use. There's no reason for me to add my 2 cents to it.
Okay. Back to you.
All right. So the next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was the role of an enterprise architect. So we've talked a lot about what architecture is. We've talked about the value of enterprise architecture. We've talked about architecture frameworks and a little bit about how you might use some of those. But what is the role of an enterprise architect? The way that I see this, and Gartner very nicely articulated in this visual that they provided, there's 5 key things that an architect does. They strategize, they architect, they lead, they govern, and they communicate. Strategy, ultimately, they are helping to extract the business strategy from business leaders in the organization when it's not articulated already on paper. The IT strategy that's been developed for an organization, they will help understand and build that out. Again, the translation of that strategy into an executable plan really is a critical part of what you do as an enterprise architect. When we talk about architecture, there's really a clear fundamental thing that we're talking about, and that is documenting the current state, developing the future state, figuring out the gaps via a gap analysis, and designing a roadmap to the future. That's really, when we talk about architecting at its core, that's what we're talking about. Current state, future state, gap analysis, and roadmap. So those two fit together very nicely hand in hand, the strategy and the architect. And then we get into a conversation about govern. A lot of folks, when they think about enterprise architecture, they think about this piece, the governance that goes on. Enterprise architects, they many times will set strategy or set standards for an organization. Many times your enterprise architects will be involved in project governance, making sure that the projects are matching the standards of the organization, matching the enterprise architecture that's been laid out. They help drive some of those decisions. We also want to use enterprise architecture because you've got that broader perspective. You want to govern the whole portfolio and make sure that we're minimizing or eliminating the overlaps between projects. That the teams that are in silos within those projects can't see themselves. So that's a key part of the work as well. And then that fourth piece, leadership. It's really important that an enterprise architect in this very visible, very strategic role has capacity for leadership in an organization. You need to be out there in front, championing and motivating the organization, helping to put forth some clear innovation and strategy that the rest of the organization can help to follow. It's very much a leadership position to be an enterprise architect. And then for me, underpinning all of that, and probably the most important thing an enterprise architects can do, but that many of us do very poorly, is communicate. It is absolutely critical that as an enterprise architect is doing all of these pieces that we mentioned above, that they are actively communicating with the organization, with the project teams, with the development teams. This is not a position where we're trying to, as enterprise architects, be right and catch people when they're wrong. This is an opportunity for us all to work together using our different perspectives to get a better answer for the company. The only way we do that is by opening up the lines of communication, communicating with the development teams, the project teams, the operations organizations, the leadership teams. That's what helps you make sure that your architectures are being adhered to, and you also have that feedback loop so that you're developing top-notch architectures for your company, and you're getting the feedback on what you're putting out to make sure that you continue to grow and improve and get better over time. So that communication piece can never be undersold.
I have two questions for you, Mike.
Great, Kathy.
One from James. He says, are there prerequisites to employing to architecting? Is there any particular level of capability recommended to proceed?
Great. I will address that particular question on, I believe it's my next slide, where I'll talk a little bit about the architecture life cycles. So if we can hold off for just a second, I will definitely cover that one.
Okay. And then Tracy has a question. She says, you mentioned 4 items: current state, future state, and gap analysis. What was the 4th item?
Current state, future state, gap analysis, and roadmaps. So roadmaps are the actual plans. The gap analysis just tells you what the difference is between where you want to go and where you are today. The roadmap is what actually sequences out how you're going to deliver the projects and in order to meet those gaps, and it's how we balance out all of the different puts and calls within an organization. Do we have the right resources? Do we have the right investment? Do we have particularly technology constraints in our organization? Do we have business process readiness constraints? Your roadmap is where you actually go through the process to figure all those things out and balance that out and get the right sequence of all of the events. Great question.
Oh, that's all for now.
All right, so let's go ahead and hit that that previous question a little bit here on this next slide. There are some typical enterprise architecture career paths, and so we'll talk about that for just a second. The career path there on top is more of a technology-centric career path where you might start out in an application development role or an operations role. You might over a period of time grow into more of a technical lead role, and then eventually after somewhere between 6 and 10 years you might move into more of an infrastructure architect role or an infrastructure SME or a solution architect. You're growing your depth as you go through this. And then once you've been in a solution architect role for a while, you might enter into a more of a segment architect role, which is taking on broader responsibilities, still primarily focused on your IT landscape and bringing together all the different pieces of your IT landscape, but now you're looking at everything under finance or everything under HR versus a specific project or a specific application. And then eventually you become an enterprise architect where you're really trying to work broadly across the entire enterprise on different perspectives. The bottom piece here is more of a business-centric career path, and that you might be in the business or you might be a business subject matter expert if you happen to be in an IT organization. You might grow into a business analysis role, and then eventually into a business architect role, which is a different kind of a role, working more closely with the business, trying to gather, collect, and understand business requirements, trying to map out business capabilities. But then if you're ultimately going to be an enterprise architect, you need to have a broadening of responsibility as well. So you might go into a different domain. You might go into information architecture or application architecture and do some work there to broaden your experiences before you become an enterprise architect with that broad kind of capability. The key, I would say, on either of these, and neither of these are necessarily prescriptive, the key is that to be an enterprise architect, it's a role that requires a significant amount of depth as well as a significant amount of breadth. And so you really need to have some time in an organization or some experience understanding how things work to be good at the job. And I would say it is valuable to have time in an organization very specifically, because one of the important pieces of working as an enterprise architect really is understanding organizational culture and what needs to happen to be able to get things done. And so people can tell you that, but you only really learn that through an experience of being in a company over an extended period of time. So these are not easy roles. Enterprise architect, solution architect, segment architect, domain architect. Those are significant roles for an organization that require a decent amount of experience, but they're also very fun roles. One of the things that we see, and we'll talk about this here on a couple of slides, is that as you hit that 6 to 10 year spot, once you've either become a business analyst or a technical lead, and you're ready to look for that next step, that's where we might see people really start to make that transition into architecture. And so that's where they would look to maybe get some different kinds of training to be able to help them understand the evolution and how things are going to be changing over time.
I have two questions for you.
Okay.
All right. So you talked about segments, and Josie asks, what are some examples of segments?
So the two things I mentioned was and my slide's not going back, so I apologize. The segments might be finance, all of the systems, all of the business processes related to your finance organization. A segment might be human resources, might be supply chain, might be sales and marketing. Those are all different segments. Basically, a segment is a grouping of business processes within an organization that makes logical sense. And so depending on how your organization scopes its enterprise architecture team and its enterprise architecture work, that segment may be small or big, but in most organizations there's some fairly clearly defined segments around finance and HR and IT for IT and supply chain and sales and marketing and R&D. Those are the typical segments that we'd see.
Okay. And Paul would like to know, he says, he asks, can an EA help an organization embrace a digital strategy?
Great question, and the answer is absolutely. When people talk about digital, what most commonly they're talking about is the application of technology to the customer-facing part of your organization or to the product of your organization. That's typically the differentiating factor there between what they talk about when they talk about IT versus what they talk about with digital. IT is typically the internally facing systems that support your organization, the supply chain, the sales, not the sales necessarily, but the finance, the HR, etc. The more internally facing stuff is typically the IT stuff. The digital stuff is typically the product and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's all part of your enterprise. It's all part of your technology landscape, and you can use enterprise architecture tools and techniques to great effect in the digital space. Absolutely. You may consider that to be a different segment, and so you may do some things slightly differently than you might if you were trying to architect the HR part of your organization. But it absolutely is a great thing to do to use enterprise architecture when doing digital transformations. In fact, I was at a local company here in Cincinnati for a number of years, and when we did our digital program, it was actually created out of and founded by our business architecture practice and was very, very heavily influenced by our enterprise architecture organization. So digital transformation, absolutely, enterprise architecture applies. Any other questions, Kathy?
Nope, you've covered them so far.
Great. All right, so let's talk real briefly about when you want to involve enterprise architecture. There's a couple of key spots where you really want to involve architecture. First off, early on in the process when you are talking about trying to bring your portfolio together, understanding the various needs, understanding what's going on, as you might have picked up when I described what enterprise architecture does, there's a lot of similarities and overlaps with portfolio management. And in fact, that roadmap that we talked about current state, future state, gap analysis, and roadmap. That roadmap is typically in a lot of organizations developed in conjunction with your portfolio management office, and is definitely very closely tied to that. So that's a great place to get enterprise architecture engaged early on. And then once you are actually running the project, enterprise architecture will come back in and do what we call enterprise architecture governance. And so they'll re-engage with the projects and help work with the projects to make sure that what the projects are putting in place is going to fit with the rest of the architecture for the organization. And so that's another time to engage. So now, as I mentioned, part of that journey of enterprise architecture is in really understanding what we're talking about when we talk about architecture. We have an introduction to enterprise architecture and IT architecture class that we teach here at Max. And as you can see here on screen, there's a 20% off webinar discount for you. We also offer up a solution architecture class, which is that next step in to the architecture career path that we were talking about. How do you work with that detailed design with projects to develop their solution architectures? And we have a 2-day, the intro class is a 1-day class, solution architecture is a 2-day class. And then TOGAF certification, TOGAF, as I mentioned, is that enterprise architecture framework. This is a certification class. It is a 4-day certification. This is probably the most highly sought after certification in the IT or in the enterprise architecture industry, and it's actually one of the most valuable from a pay perspective certifications in the IT industry. It's come out fairly high on the top 10 each of the last 3 years. So that's a nice certification, and what that does is that actually brings in enterprise architecture thinking and the TOGAF components and the TOGAF ADM, the methodology. And that TOGAF methodology can actually be applied to both solution architecture, business architecture, segment architecture, and enterprise architecture. So you can use it at any point in time, but it is one of those things that it is a little bit bigger investment, being a 4-day certification class. So you want to make sure that you are interested in this as a career before you step down that path. And then the last one on there, the introduction to IT for IT. IT for IT is a new industry reference architecture for the management of IT, and so we're offering up a 1-day introduction class to talk to folks about that and help explain that. That's actually really useful to someone that's got responsibility for IT as a segment, as an architect. It's also going to be a great class for any IT professional, simply because it will give you a better understanding of how IT works from a big picture perspective and how the different components of IT fit together and how value is delivered through IT back to the business. So that's a course I would also highly recommend to you.
Let me jump in there real quick, Mike, and just say to everyone, this 20% offer doesn't mean you have to pay, because if some people are going to have your company pay and you've got to go through processes, you don't have to wait for that. What we're asking is we need to know your interest, and you need to reserve a spot with us before 5 p.m. on Monday, and then you can work out all the payment details if your company's going to pay for that after the fact. So I just want to make sure I put that in there. So we have a poll.
Yes,
Yep.
we do. So why don't we switch over to that?
Yep. And what we would like to know, everybody, is how interested would you be? Because we've set time aside, we've set classrooms aside, Mike's time, he's teaching these classes, and we want to know how interested are you in taking, for instance, the introduction to the enterprise and IT architecture class. So we've got 42% have voted. And 73, very good, great responses, keep it up. I love seeing this 77. We'll keep it open for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll close the poll. We have 80% have voted. And here's the interest, Mike. Can you see that?
I can. Well, very good. Thank you for taking the time to vote.
To let us know.
Obviously, enterprise architecture isn't for everybody, but hopefully some of you have, and it sounds like looking at the results, it looks like some of you may have gotten a spark through this conversation and might be interested in that. So, Kathy, you want to say something real quick?
I was just going to say, for those of you who are interested, just keep a lookout for the email that you'll receive as a follow-up with a link to the recording and the slide deck. It will also have direct links to those courses for you and information on how to follow up.
All right, so just kind of wrap everything up, in summary, we've talked about a number of different things today. We talked about how enterprise architecture is the translation of corporate strategy into an executable plan for transformation for the business. It's also the alignment of that plan back within the organization. So it's not enough to just create the plan. You have to get people bought in and willing to participate in it. We talked about how enterprise architecture delivers value for an organization through higher profitability, faster time to market, and reduced corporate risk. We talked a little bit about the different frameworks. We talked about TOGAF and Zachman in detail. We talked in very brief about DODAF and FIAF. And then we went through how probably the best approach is to use a tailored framework and method, taking the best of the different frameworks that are out there and then tailoring them to fit for you and your organization. And then we talked a little bit about the career path for enterprise architecture and the role of an enterprise architect. Hopefully you've gotten a sense, just like I feel, enterprise architecture can be a very challenging, very rewarding career. I've done a lot of different things in IT across my career over the last 25 years, and this role of enterprise architect has been the one that far and away I have enjoyed the most personally, and so hopefully you've seen just a little bit of that today. So while we're giving you a chance to put in some final questions here, you can see up on screen how you can connect with me. I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. You also see my email. If you have any questions that come up after today, or if you have questions that we don't get a chance to answer, feel free to reach out to me on any of those avenues. I'd be happy to have a follow-up conversation with you. But if there are any questions, we'll open it up to questions here today.
Okay. And while we're waiting, if you just advance one more slide just to let these folks know, if any of these other classes are of interest to you, we have quite a few here in the IT operations side that are coming up. Everything from Azure, IIS 8.5, Fundamentals of Active Directory. You can see Windows Server 2012 R2 services. There's Windows PowerShell, automating, and even advanced. And we have some accelerated classes which are specific, something that Max has done. We take 5-day classes and reduce them down so that you're not out of the office as often. Anyway, all of these classes are available also for 20% off. Again, the same deal. If you just let us know you want to reserve a seat, let us know before 5 p.m. on Monday. We do have one question. If you have any other questions, go ahead and type those in and we can ask Mike for those.
And I do want to also mention, before she asks the question, if before we close out here, there are a couple of handouts that are available to you in the GoToMeeting panel. There's a business executive guide to IT architecture, which you may find interesting. And there is also an interview by the Journal of Enterprise Architecture with Vish Viswanathan, who is our CEO here at CC&C Solutions and one of the early participants and founders of TOGAF and the TOGAF training certification program. He actually created and built the TOGAF training and certification program. It's a really interesting interview that we want to share with folks, talking about his perspective on enterprise architecture today. So you'll need to download those. Those we're including just for webinar participants here in the webinar panel. They won't be available online like the slides will be, so just go ahead and download those real quick if either of those sparks an interest. Yep. Kathy, the questions?
Yep, we have a question from Eric, and he said, can you explain a little more about what a domain architect is?
Sure. So as you may remember from one of the very early slides, there are typically, as defined by TOGAF anyways, 4 domains of architecture: business, data or information, application, and technology. Some frameworks. Some companies also include security or integration as potential domains. Just depends on the framework you're using. But TOGAF, we simply call it the 4 domains. The role of a domain architect is to work with the different, we use business architecture for an example, to work with the various business analysts and business architects in the particular segments, to look at the business architecture for a company as a whole, to try and put together a plan for business architecture over time for a company. So it's not looking at the entire picture of a company from a breadth and depth perspective, but it is looking at the breadth of a company when it's related to one of those 4 domains, whether it be business architecture, where you're really looking at business processes and business capability maps and information flows, or whether it be information architecture, where you may be looking at data structures, you may be looking at data management processes or big data or analytics, you may be looking at data models, you may be looking at, again, information flows or key performance indicators. Application architecture, you're typically looking at all of the different applications that are in place for a company. You may be looking at broadly things like application portfolio management or application rationalization, kind of looking at the landscape as a whole and seeing where you've got gaps and overlaps in the applications your company makes available. And then technology architecture is typically looking more at the shared capabilities of a company, the servers, the storage, the network, all the different things that might fall into more of an infrastructure perspective. And again, looking at how are you driving discussions around technology portfolio management, trying to make sure that you only have a minimal set of programming languages you allow, or a minimum set of server types that you allow within a company, so that you've got supportability and interoperability between your various technologies. And so that's the role of a domain architect, is to look broadly across the company within the context of one of those 4 domains specifically.
Okay, thank you.
And to just kind of flesh out this before we go to the next question, the segment architect is responsible for looking within a particular vertical slice of a company, but looking at all 4 domains, business, information, application, and technology, and trying to bring those together for that segment. A solution architect is responsible for looking at all 4 domains in the context of a project or a single application. So it's a much smaller subset of work than your segment architects would do. Solution architects tend to be logically and physically based in the work that they do, doing logical designs and physical designs. Enterprise segment architects, domain architects, enterprise architects tend to be more conceptual and logical in the work that they do, because they're looking at a higher level, bigger picture for the company.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. Andrew asks, how are EAs vetted in an interview? What skills are essential?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. It really depends on the company and who's doing the interview process, but some of it, I think, it is asking questions about some of the work that they've done, the experiences that they've had. I think there are some questions that you can ask about an understanding of different frameworks or different pieces of the architecture that you might do. If you are looking specifically for a specific kind of architect, you could ask detailed questions around how somebody might put together a roadmap, or how they might look at and evaluate a particular decision in a space, and ask them to put together some thoughts around what that kind of information they might need to make that decision. Another key piece of the interview process is understanding communication styles and approaches for your enterprise architects. As I mentioned, your architects are really need to be focused on good communication. They're going to need to interact with a lot of different levels in the organization, a lot of different people in an organization, and they're also going to need to interact with both the business and IT leadership. So it's important that they're good communicators. So an interview may include some questions around communication styles and approaches. You might ask, have you had experience trying to sell in an architecture where it didn't go well? And you might probe at how they handled situations like this and what were some of their approaches to align people to the architectures that they're putting forward. So those are some of the things you might talk to somebody about in an interview for an architect.
Very good. I don't have any more questions, so it looks like everybody is getting ready to head back to work. Our lunch and learn, we have 5 minutes left.
Very good. Well, as Kathy had mentioned, you can expect to get an email from Max as a follow-up. And then if you think of additional questions, feel free to either reach out to Kathy at maxtrain.com or me at any of the available spots that you see on screen. So with that, I think we're good, Kathy.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Mike, so much for your time. Let me see, what do we have here? No, I just have a lot of people throwing in into the questions, just saying thank you, saying very informative, thank you for your time, Mike, etc. So thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.